I never thought my own children would throw me away like yesterday's newspaper. But there I was at 60, listening to my younger son, Marcus, slam my last suitcase into his car trunk while my older son, David's footsteps shuffled nervously in the doorway behind me. Before we continue, like and subscribe. Tell me when children should be forgiven. 25 years ago, their father walked out with nothing but a divorce note. I raised Marcus and David alone after that, working double shifts at the diner, missing my own birthdays for their football games, selling my grandmother's ring for David's college books. I thought we'd built something unbreakable. The first crack appeared when I'd fallen in the shower 3 months earlier. Nothing serious, just a bruised hip that made me move slower for a few weeks. Marcus had come by that evening, pacing my kitchen like a caged animal, talking about how I couldn't live alone anymore and how they'd found a nice place. David had nodded along, the steady tapping of his wedding ring against my wooden table, both of them speaking about me like I wasn't sitting right there. But that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was the way they'd stopped looking at me during those final conversations, the way David's voice went flat when he said they'd already put down a deposit at Sunset Manor, the way Marcus kept checking his phone like he had somewhere more important to be than planning his mother's exile. The ride to the nursing home was 23 minutes of country music and silence. Marcus's hand squeaked against the steering wheel, taking the long way around downtown, past the park where I'd pushed both boys on swings until my arms ached, past the corner market where we'd bought penny candy on good days and milk with food stamps on bad ones. Instead, I was being delivered to Sunset Manor with its sterile lobbies and the smell of industrial disinfectant. 47 minutes of signing papers while Marcus rushed through forms like he was late for something urgent. David had stayed in the car, engine humming, radio playing softly as I was processed like a returned library book. Marcus handed the nurse my important documents. Inside was a letter I'd written 3 years ago but never sent, about my fears of growing old alone, my hopes to stay close to family. The nurse smiled as she filed it with my papers, not knowing she was filing my broken dreams. Marcus kissed my forehead, his lips dry and quick, and promised to visit soon. Weeks later, David found that letter in my file, and for once, he read every word. The automatic doors whooshed shut behind him, then silence, and I stood in the lobby holding a plastic bag with my medications and a room assignment written on a yellow sticky note. Room 247B had a view of the parking lot and a roommate named Florence who'd been there for 6 years and counted ceiling tiles when she couldn't sleep. The bed was narrow and hard, dressed in sheets that smelled like industrial bleach, and my window faced west where afternoon traffic sounds would drift in with the warm breeze. I thought I knew the truth. Almost. The truth was that I'd become an inconvenience, a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. What I didn't know yet was that this was just the beginning. The first month passed in a haze of scheduled meals and mandatory activities. Bingo on Tuesday evenings, wheelchair exercises on Thursday mornings, visiting hours that came and went with empty hallways and silent phones. I learned the rhythm of institutional life, medication at 8 and 4, lights out at 9, the night nurse's soft-soled shoes squeaking past my door every 2 hours. Florence told me about her daughter in Phoenix who sent Christmas cards but never visited, about her grandson who'd promised to come next month for 3 years running. We became experts in the mathematics of abandonment, counting days between phone calls that never came, measuring love in forgotten birthdays and rescheduled visits. 2 months in, news started filtering through visitors. David at the bank applying for loans. Marcus's wife Sarah in emergency twice. Panic attacks. It was Mrs. Rodriguez's nephew who delivered the real bombshell during his weekly visit in early November. He worked for a construction company that had been hired to assess flood damage, and he'd mentioned a house on Maple Street, David's address, that had suffered significant water damage from a burst pipe. The insurance company was dragging their feet, he said, and the family was living in a hotel while contractors gave estimates that kept climbing higher. Meanwhile, Marcus had been calling in sick to his job at the auto plant, dealing with Sarah's increasing anxiety and their 8-year-old daughter Emma's questions about why Grandma Anna had gone away. The stress was eating through their savings like acid through metal, and Emma had been asking to visit me every week, sobbing into the phone when they told her the nursing home was too far away for regular visits. 4 months later, the phone rang. David's voice shaky and wrong. "Can I come by to talk?" I almost said no. Almost told him visiting hours were Wednesday through Sunday, just like the sign he'd never bothered to read. Instead, I said yes, and hung up before he could hear the way my voice broke on that single word. He arrived the next day carrying a bouquet of grocery store flowers, yellow chrysanthemums that reminded me of the ones I'd planted in his yard 2 springs ago, before I became an inconvenience. His voice was raspier than I remembered, and his breathing seemed labored, like he'd forgotten how to take care of himself. David settled into the vinyl visitor's chair next to my bed, the chair creaking as he fidgeted restlessly, and told me about the flood, about the insurance fights, about sleeping in a hotel room with his wife and 2 kids for 6 weeks, while contractors promised repairs that never seemed to start. He told me about Marcus losing his overtime shifts because of missed days, about Sarah's panic attacks getting worse, about Emma crying herself to sleep asking for me. But there was one thing I hadn't seen yet. The thing I hadn't seen was how completely they'd fallen apart without me, not just practically, but emotionally. David's marriage was strained to the breaking point, with his wife Jennifer taking extra after-school tutoring jobs and weekend test prep sessions to make up for the insurance shortfall, barely speaking to him when she came home exhausted and angry. Marcus and Sarah were talking about separation, their fights escalating every night after Emma went to bed, both of them drowning in stress and blame and the weight of decisions they'd made in anger rather than love. David's voice cracked when he asked if I would consider coming home, as if my exile had been my choice, as if I'd been vacationing at Sunset Manor instead of counting ceiling tiles and eating institutional meatloaf while they rebuilt their lives without me. I looked at my son, this man who'd once brought me dandelions from the yard and called them flowers for Mama, who'd cried in my arms after his first heartbreak, who'd asked me to teach him how to make my grandmother's apple pie the week before his wedding. And I felt something break and heal simultaneously in my chest. The answer came from somewhere deeper than hurt, somewhere I'd forgotten existed during these months of silence and fluorescent lights and scheduled activities designed to fill time rather than create meaning. I told him no. Not because I didn't love him, not because I couldn't forgive him, but because some lessons can only be learned in the space where consequences meet choice. I told him that I'd found something in this sterile place that I'd lost somewhere along the way, the knowledge that I deserved better than being someone's convenient solution to an inconvenient problem. I told him about Florence, who'd become my friend, about the volunteer reading program I'd started, about the advocacy group forming to improve conditions for residents without regular visitors. I told him about discovering that I still had fight left in me, still had purpose beyond being useful to people who would discard me when usefulness ran out. David cried then, real tears I could hear in his shaky breathing, and I reached out to touch his hand, not to comfort him, but to let him feel that I was still his mother, still loved him, still hoped for better from him. The next few weeks brought Marcus, then phone calls from both daughters-in-law, then Emma with her sweet voice reading aloud, "I miss you, Grandma Anna," from a card she'd made. They wanted forgiveness that came with solutions, apologies that included moving trucks, and promises to do better this time. But doing better doesn't work backwards. It doesn't undo the moment when your children look at you and see burden instead of blessing, when they choose convenience over compassion, when they forget that unconditional love is supposed to flow both ways. I kept saying no, and each time it got easier, not because I loved them less, but because I was finally learning to love myself enough to demand better. The nursing home wasn't my forever, but neither was being someone's afterthought. called upon in crisis and dismissed in calm. Florence and I started planning for our own apartment, pooling our Social Security checks and dreaming about a place with a garden where we could grow tomatoes and invite the grandchildren who wanted to visit. We talked about the difference between being needed and being valued, between family obligation and family love. 6 months later, I moved into a small duplex with Florence, 20 minutes from both my sons, but worlds away from the desperate people who'd abandoned me at Sunset Manor. When I moved out, I requested my file from the office. The letter came home with me. Emma visits every Saturday now, and we plant seeds in window boxes while she tells me about school and friends and the divorce that Marcus and Sarah couldn't prevent despite all their desperate attempts to fix what they'd broken. David rebuilt his house, but not his marriage. Some floods damaged more than just the foundation. Marcus kept his job but lost his certainty that family would always be there to catch him when he fell. Jennifer filed for divorce 3 months after our conversation, taking the kids and half the insurance settlement, leaving David alone in his renovated house with empty rooms that echoed with all the words he should have said differently. And me? I learned that sometimes the people who throw you away are doing you a favor, forcing you to discover that you're stronger, more valuable, more worthy of love than you ever imagined while you were busy being indispensable to people who didn't know your worth until they'd lost it. They thought the story ended there. It didn't. Now Emma calls me every Tuesday evening, her voice bright with stories about art class and soccer practice, and sometimes I hear David in the background, alone in that big house, probably wishing he could take back the day he decided I was more trouble than treasure. Marcus sends birthday cards now, careful handwritten notes that arrive exactly on time, signed with love he's learning to express in words instead of convenience. The envelope with my unsent letter sits in my dresser drawer now, a reminder that some dreams die so better, ones can take their place. Florence and I tend our garden, share our stories, and welcome visitors who come because they want to, not because they have to. We've learned that chosen family can be stronger than blood family, that respect earns love more surely than obligation ever could. They still call sometimes, my sons, asking if I've thought about it more, if maybe we could try again. But the woman who would have said yes to anything just to avoid being alone died in room 2, 47B at Sunset Manor. The woman who replaced her knows the difference between loneliness and solitude, between being abandoned and being free.